In our previous video, we met Montano, the African warrior, who became one of the most powerful vampires in European history. But there's a crucial part of his journey that deserves much deeper analysis. Today, we're diving into the world Montano encountered when he left the plains of Kilimanjaro and entered the beating heart of the greatest empire humanity has ever known, Imperial Rome. This isn't just historical context. It's the key to understanding how a tribal shaman from Africa transformed into the commander of the Victory Legion, how his African values collided and merged with the Roman military machine, and how this cultural fusion created one of the most honored and feared vampiric leaders in history. We're going to explore the Rome that Montano knew in the first centuries of the Common Era. A Rome at the height of its power, but also beginning to show the first cracks in its foundation. A Rome that dominated 3 continents, but was being slowly transformed by all the cultures it conquered. To understand Montano, we need to understand this Rome. We need to walk the same streets he walked, understand the politics he manipulated, and comprehend the military system he mastered, because it was in this cauldron of power, intrigue, and blood that the African warrior became an immortal legend. When Montano arrives in Rome, probably between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was in a fascinating phase of its history. It was no longer the warrior republic that conquered the Mediterranean, but not yet the divided and decadent empire that would fall centuries later. It was something in between, something unique in human history. The empire stretched across approximately 5 million square kilometers, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the sands of Syria, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Africa. About 60 to 70 million people lived under Roman rule, speaking hundreds of languages, practicing dozens of religions, but all united under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But this peace was maintained by force. The Roman legions, with about 300,000 professional soldiers at the empire's peak, patrolled borders stretching more than 10,000 kilometers. These weren't just occupation troops. They were highly trained, disciplined, and lethally efficient war machines. Each legion had about 5,000 men, divided into cohorts, centuries, and contubernia, each unit functioning as part of a perfectly coordinated military organism. The city of Rome itself was the beating heart of this empire, with more than 1 million inhabitants. It was the largest city the world had ever seen. Imagine the narrow, winding streets, lined with insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings where most people lived in cramped conditions. Contrast this with the vast domus, the mansions of the rich, with their decorated atriums, internal gardens, and elaborate frescoes. The Roman Forum was the nerve center of imperial politics. Here, senators in purple-trimmed togas debated the laws of the empire. Here, the emperor himself sometimes appeared to consult the Senate or announce new conquests, but real power no longer rested with the Senate. The Principate, established by Augustus, had concentrated power in the hands of the emperor and his inner court. Roman society was rigidly stratified. At the top were the senators, about 600 men from Rome's oldest and wealthiest families. Below them, the equestrians, the knight class that formed the administrative and commercial elite. Then came the plebeians, common citizens, and at the base of the pyramid, the slaves, who could represent 20 to 30% of the population in some regions. But this was a society in transformation. The army, traditionally recruited from Roman citizens, was increasingly composed of auxiliaries from all parts of the empire: Thracians, Gauls, Syrians, Germans, and Africans. served in the legions, earning Roman citizenship after 25 years of service. This was the Rome becoming cosmopolitan, multicultural, a fusion of all the civilizations it conquered. Roman religion was also in flux. The traditional gods of the Roman pantheon were still worshipped, but Eastern cults, like those of Isis, Mithras, and eventually Christ, were gaining more and more followers. The emperor was officially deified after his death, and sometimes even in life, creating an imperial cult that united politics and religion in ways that would be familiar to Montano, accustomed to tribal leaders who were also spiritual figures. The empire's economy was vast and complex. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Oil from Hispania lit its houses. Silk from China adorned its wealthy women. Slaves from Germania worked in its mines. Trade flowed through a network of roads totaling more than 80,000 kilometers, with the Via Appia, Via Flaminia, and dozens of others connecting all parts of the empire. This was the world into which Montano was introduced, a world of power incomprehensible to someone from the African plains, but also a world he would recognize in some fundamental aspects. Rome, like the Maasai tribes, was a warrior society. Rome, like the Falcon people, valued honor, loyalty, and courage. These similarities would allow Montano to navigate this new world, while the differences would challenge him to evolve beyond his tribal origins. To understand how Montano became one of the greatest military commanders in vampiric history, we need to dive deeply into the Roman military system he mastered and eventually transformed. The Roman legion was much more than a simple army. It was a total institution that shaped men, built roads and aqueducts, established colonies, and of course conquered enemies. Let's dissect this war machine piece by piece. A complete legion had about 5,500 men divided into 10 cohorts. The first cohort was the elite, with about 800 of the legion's best soldiers. The other 9 cohorts had about 480 men each. Each cohort was divided into 6 centuries of 80 men, commanded by a centurion. The centurions were the backbone of the Roman army, experienced officers who had risen through the ranks and knew every aspect of war. A legionary's equipment was standardized and efficient. The helmet, or galea, was made of iron or bronze and offered significant protection against sword blows and projectiles. The armor, the larica segmentata, consisted of articulated iron strips that protected the torso without sacrificing mobility. The shield, or scutum, was a masterpiece of engineering, made of laminated wood layers, covered with leather and reinforced with metal on the edges. It measured about 1 meter 20 in height and weighed about 10 kilograms, but could deflect spears and arrows with ease. The weapons were equally impressive. The gladius, the short Roman sword, was about 60 to 80 centimeters long and designed to pierce, not slash. In close combat, a trained soldier could make 10 to 15 piercing attacks per minute, each potentially lethal. The pilum, the Roman javelin, was an ingenious weapon. The wooden shaft was connected to a long iron point through rivets that broke on impact. This meant that when a pilum hit an enemy shield, the iron point bent and the javelin hung, making the shield useless and forcing the enemy to discard it. But the true power of the legion wasn't in individual equipment, but in collective tactics. The Testudo formation, or tortoise, saw soldiers form a box with their shields, protecting themselves from all sides and from above against projectiles. This formation could advance slowly under showers of arrows, reaching enemy walls virtually unscathed. The wedge, or Cuneus, was used to pierce enemy lines, concentrating force on a narrow point. The Acies Triplex formation, 3 lines of soldiers, allowed fresh troops to replace tired ones without breaking the battle line. Training was brutal and incessant. A new recruit went through 4 months of basic training that the historian Vegetius described in detail. Marches of 30 kilometers with full equipment weighing about 30 to 40 kilograms were done 3 times a week. Exercises with wooden weapons against training posts were performed daily. Each recruit had to make 6,000 sword strikes per day. Swimming, jumping, climbing, everything was practiced until it became instinct. Discipline was fierce. A soldier who slept on sentry duty could be beaten to death by his own comrades. A unit that fled from battle could be decimated, literally 1 in every 10 men executed by lottery. But those who excelled were generously rewarded. Promotions, medals, cash, bonuses, and eventually Roman citizenship for non-citizen auxiliaries. But the legion wasn't just a combat force. It was an engineering unit. Legionaries built fortified camps every night during campaigns, works that included ditches, palisades, and watchtowers. They built roads that lasted centuries. They erected aqueducts, bridges, and walls. The famous Hadrian's Wall, stretching 118 kilometers across northern England, was built almost entirely by logistics were equally impressive. A legion on campaign needed about 7.5 tons of grain per day to feed its men. Each soldier carried rations for 3 days, but massive baggage trains followed the army, transported by about 500 mules per legion. Roman logistics were so efficient that armies could operate hundreds of kilometers from their supply bases for months on end. This was the system that Montano entered and eventually commanded. For a Maasai warrior accustomed to small-scale tribal combat based on individual courage and quick raids, the Roman military system must have been a revelation. Here was a form of warfare that depended not just on bravery, but on organization, discipline, engineering, and logistics. It was war as science, and Montano, with his sharp intelligence, absorbed every lesson, but he also brought something unique to this system. The Maasai were formidable warriors in their own right, known for their ferocity and hand-to-hand combat techniques. Montano fused Roman discipline with African fury, creating something new. His Victory Legion troops became known not just for their discipline, but for their almost suicidal courage in battle, advancing where other legions would hesitate. If the military system was one aspect of the Roman world that Montano mastered, the imperial court was another, perhaps even more treacherous and complex. Here, battles were fought, not with swords, but with words, alliances, and betrayals. And here, the vampiric presence was stronger and more dangerous. The Imperial Roman court in the first centuries of the Common Era was a nest of intrigue. The emperor, theoretically the most powerful man in the world, was constantly surrounded by conspirators, ambitious senators, generals with loyal legions, members of the imperial family itself, all potentially conspired to seize power. Roman history is full of emperors assassinated, poisoned, stabbed, or forced to suicide. Consider the numbers of the first 25 Roman emperors, from Augustus to Carinus, about 27 BC to 280. At least 15 died violently, were assassinated, or forced to kill themselves. That's a mortality rate of 60%. No position in human history was more dangerous than being Roman emperor. The Praetorian Guard, theoretically the emperor's personal bodyguards, were often the conspirators. About 9,000 elite soldiers, stationed in Rome and receiving double the pay of a common legionary, the Praetorians had the power to make and unmake in 193. They literally auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder after assassinating Emperor Didius Julianus, bought the empire for 25,000 sesterces per Praetorian soldier, a total of about 225 million sesterces, or approximately 5,600 kilograms of gold. But behind these deadly mortal intrigues, there was an even more sinister layer: vampiric manipulation. The Ventrue, Lasombra and Toreador clans had significant presence in Rome, each using their supernatural abilities to influence human events. The Ventrue, the clan that traditionally considered itself the natural leaders of vampires, saw the Roman Empire as their creation. They claimed that Ventrue vampires had guided Rome since its founding, that Romulus and Remus were Ventrue pawns, that Julius Caesar himself had been influenced by Ventrue vampiric advisors. Truth or propaganda, the fact was that the Ventrue had deep connections with Rome's oldest senatorial families. Ventrue power came from their discipline of domination, the ability to control human minds. A Ventrue senator could dominate a human emperor, making him make decisions that benefited the clan. But this control had limitations. Domination required eye contact and verbal commands, and its effects could be broken if contradicted by the victim's strong beliefs or loyalties. It was a subtle tool, best used for small nudges in the desired direction, not absolute control. The Lasombra Montanos clan were different. They didn't seek to control emperors and senators, but worked through institutions. The Lasombra influenced the emerging church, the legions commercial houses. Their discipline of abomination, the ability to manipulate shadows, made them masters of moving unseen, of clean assassinations, of creating terror and confusion. But the Lasombra's true strength was their organization. Lasombra, the antediluvian himself, had created a rigid, hierarchical system for his clan. Each Lasombra vampire knew their place, their duties, their superiors and subordinates. This structure allowed the clan to act with coordination that other clans couldn't match. When the Lasombra clan decided on a course of action, all members worked together to achieve it. Montano was a crucial part of this machine. His Victory Legion wasn't just a military force, but an intelligence network. His soldiers, many of them ghouls fed with vampiric blood, and therefore supernaturally strong and loyal, were throughout the empire. They watched, reported, and when necessary, acted. An enemy of the Lasombra clan could wake up dead in their bed anywhere in the empire, victim of Montano's nocturnal assassins. The Toreador were the third major player in Imperial Rome. This clan of artists and aesthetes valued beauty and art above all else. But don't underestimate the Toreador. They controlled vast wealth through artistic patronage and influenced public opinion through art and theater. A Toreador could ruin an enemy's reputation through a satirical play in the theater, or elevate an ally by funding monuments in their honor. The interaction between these three clans and other minor ones created a web of intrigues that made mortal politics seem simple by comparison. Alliances were formed and broken, not over years, but over decades and centuries. A favor done in 100 BC could be collected in 200 AD. An offense in 50 AD could result in revenge in 300 AD. Vampires thought long-term in ways mortals couldn't comprehend. Montano navigated this world with the same skill he commanded troops. He formed alliances with Ventrue vampires who respected his honor and military ability. He worked with some Toreador who appreciated the African warrior aesthetic he maintained, and within his own Lasombra clan. He gradually rose through the hierarchy, not through betrayal or dirty politics, but through pure competence and unwavering loyalty. His reputation as someone whose word was absolutely trustworthy made him paradoxically more valuable. In a world where every vampire assumed all others would lie, betray, and manipulate, Montano was known for keeping his promises, even at terrible cost to himself. This reputation wasn't weakness, but strength. Other vampires knew that a deal with Montano would be honored, so they made deals with him they wouldn't make with less trustworthy vampires. But this honor also had a cost. Montano saw alliances between mortals and vampires that horrified him. He saw Ventrue vampires treat humans as cattle, feeding on slaves to death and discarding them. He saw Lasombra vampires manipulate entire human families over generations, creating and destroying bloodlines like a cattle breeder manages their herd. He saw Toreador vampires seduce and destroy human artists, sucking not just their blood, but their creativity and will to live. Part of Montano must have wondered if he had made the right choice in accepting the vampiric curse, but he had committed to his oath to the antediluvian Lasombra, and his honor wouldn't allow him to break that oath. So he found ways to maintain his humanity within the limits of his vampiric service. He treated his ghouls with respect, ensured humans under his protection were treated fairly, and used his power to curb the worst excesses of other vampires when he could. This tension between his personal code of honor and the demands of his vampiric existence would shape Montano for the next millennia. It was a tension that would never be fully resolved, but that would keep him human in ways most vampires had long forgotten. The fusion of African values and Roman power that Montano represented wasn't unique in history, but it was extraordinary in its scale and lasting impact. Consider other cases in history where warriors from barbarian cultures entered the Roman military system and left lasting marks. Arminius, the Germanic chieftain who destroyed 3 Roman legions in the Testudo forest in night, had served in the Roman army and used Roman training against Rome. Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator who led the largest slave revolt in Roman history, also had Roman military knowledge, but these men used their knowledge to destroy Rome. Montano was different. He became part of Rome, but never lost his African identity. This duality made him unique. Modern historians studying Roman Africa, like Professor David Mattingly from the University of Leicester, note that Africa wasn't simply colonized by Rome, but entered into a complex symbiotic relationship with the empire. Romanized Africans and Africanized Romans created new hybrid cultures. Montano was the personification of this hybridization, but elevated to a supernatural level. He had the longevity to see this cultural fusion develop over centuries. He could take lessons learned in tribal Africa and apply them to Roman politics centuries later. He could take Roman military tactics and refine them with insights from African warfare accumulated over generations. The impact of this approach is visible in the later history of the Lasombra clan. Montano's Victory Legion became the model for elite vampiric forces in subsequent centuries. The idea of combining rigid military discipline with fierce personal loyalty, of creating small but extremely effective forces instead of massive armies, of valuing quality over quantity. All of this comes from the tradition established by Montano. Even today, in our modern world, we see echoes of this philosophy. Military special forces, like the Navy SEALs, British SAS, or Russian Spetsnaz, operate on principles that Montano would have recognized. Rigorous selection, brutal training, small and cohesive units, extreme loyalty among members, and effectiveness that far exceeds their size. They are Montano's legions reincarnated for the modern era. Montano's very existence also raises fascinating questions about African representation in vampiric history. For a long time, vampire narratives were dominated by European figures. Dracula, Carmilla, Nosferatu, all the great vampires of fiction were white Europeans. Montano's story challenges that narrative, showing that African vampires weren't just present, but fundamental to European vampiric history. Scholars studying African representation in fantasy, like Professor Kinitra Brooks from Michigan State University, argue that we need more narratives that center African experiences, not as victims or secondary characters, but as protagonists who shape events. Montano is exactly that, an African protagonist whose honor, skill, and strategic vision made him one of the most powerful and respected vampires in history. The Rome that Montano knew was an empire at the height of its power, a military machine without parallel in history, and a court of deadly mortal and immortal intrigues. It was a world that could easily have crushed the African warrior, turning him into just another forgotten auxiliary soldier. But Montano didn't allow that to happen. He took the best of his African traditions, the Maasai code of honor, the ferocity of the Falcon warrior, and fused it with the best Rome offered: Roman military discipline, sophisticated strategy, and long-term imperial vision. From this fusion emerged something new, something more powerful than either of the original cultures alone, and in doing so, in refusing to give up his African identity even while embracing Roman power, Montano showed a path that few vampires followed. He proved it was possible to maintain personal honor in a world of monsters, maintain humanity amid immortality, and build something of lasting value even under Cain's curse. This is the true lesson of Montano's story. It's not just about an African warrior who became a Roman vampire lord. It's about how identity, honor, and personal values can not only survive, but thrive, even in the most extreme circumstances. It's about how the fusion of cultures can create something stronger than any culture alone. And it's about how individual choices, even choices made under coercion, can shape destinies for millennia. If you want to know more about how Montano used these lessons over the centuries, if you want to see how his honor was repeatedly tested and how he found ways to remain true to himself, even in the face of pressure from antediluvians and Lasombra himself, leave it in the comments. Montano's journey through vampiric history is just beginning. Subscribe to the channel for more deep analyses of historical mysteries and forgotten vampiric legends. And if you know someone fascinated by ancient Rome, by African history, or by vampire narratives that challenge stereotypes, share this video. Montano's story reminds us that the greatest heroes and the most complex monsters often come from where we least expect them.